Well, DC Comics looks potentially poised to make some old characters fresh and exciting to me again. I love it when they do that. Hopefully, that's what I'm seeing hints of right now. I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Welcome to Essential Issues Weekly, where I talk about DC Comics 1 week after their release on the Ultra tier of the DC Universe Infinite subscription service. In each installment, I pick an assortment of comics to talk about as a DC fan and also explore what, if anything, they have to say about the essential issues of real life. Now, warning, full spoilers for everything I talk about. That's your first and only warning. All right, so I'm doing this in two parts. Doing a little bit of catch up, so I'm covering 2 weeks in a single installment. First, we're looking at comics released on the Ultra tier on December 4th, originally published November 6th. 2024. First from those is Batman number 154. Just some brief comments. This is still part of the All-In initiative intended by DC to help new readers jump on board. This also written by Chip Zdarsky, I believe is the name of the writer, who's been handling Batman for a while now. And nothing like super exciting about this. It's just kind of nice meat and potatoes Batman for me, where there's a murder mystery going on. There's a number of potential suspects, but we're still just kind of gathering clues, establishing who the main players are, and still in the background is the bonkers scenario of Vandal Savage being the police commissioner in the wake of the mayor's murder. He's like a primary suspect, but they're wondering, well, is this a Court of Owls thing maybe that's going on? And then you've also got this, what's his name, Commander Star, I don't know, this red, white, and blue with lots of black as well, vigilante that is seemingly kind of like a meaner, tougher, I'm going to actually get the job done right kind of crime fighter, trying to seemingly make Batman seem obsolete. Still at this point, a lot of just kind of pieces being put in place, but I'm very intrigued by what they're doing and what they're maybe building up to. So that's Batman 154. One of the most surprising and exciting books for me to read this week was Batgirl number 1, written by Tate Bromble, if that's how you say their name. Anyway, this is the Cassandra Cain Batgirl. And back in the day, I want to say late 90s, early 2000s, when she first came on the scene, I was like, okay, I like the costume design. I was never into the concept of Batgirl. I thought it was just silly and stuff. It took Gail Simone a decade or more later to really convince me that I could enjoy stories written about Batgirl. Well, this is a very different take, but I guess maybe because of Gail Simone, I'm a little bit more primed to be open to the possibilities here. And reading this first issue makes me want to go back and read the back issues of the era where Cassandra Cain was Batgirl. One thing that I did not know, because I just haven't been paying that much attention to this version of the character, is that evidently Cassandra Cain, despite her last name, is Lady Shiva's daughter, who is like the premier martial artist in the DC universe. She is the one that, like, man, if you can beat her, well, I don't know if anyone has ever beaten her, but like, she's basically a device that is brought into stories that want to establish how good a martial artist is, because they're going to in some way go up against Lady Shiva. They're going to be trained by Lady Shiva. I had no idea that she had a daughter, legitimate or otherwise. I don't know anything about that, but they make that very clear at the beginning. And also that somewhere in the promotional stuff for this series, this is touted as a mother-daughter kind of team-up thing. And so anytime you're going to be introducing family relationships into a comic book, a variety of kinds of family relationships, you're really going to have my attention, because there is so much inherent drama, whether those relationships are functional and loving or totally self-destructive and toxic and all kinds of stuff. And Batgirl's relationship with her mom, the Lady Shiva, seems to fall a little bit into the latter category. Well, actually a lot, or completely. And so that's certainly going to introduce some drama. But we're also, on top of that great premise to construct a story around, the way the story's being told takes us inside the mind of Cassandra and how she is just trained and disciplined in reading tells, reading body language. So she's observing her mother's glance, her mother's touch of like her ear or her earring. She's aware of like her mother's heartbeat by watching her jugular vein. She's evaluating her mother's smile, and she is trained in all of these things, both in and out of combat, to know what her opponent's next move is going to be, whether or not they are going to do what they seem to be wanting you to think they're going to do, whether they are being truthful or deceitful. And Cassandra Cain is able to tell every time that her mother is lying or telling the truth. And so in conversation, that gets especially interesting when her mother will say something like, "My daughter means nothing," which she tries to convince a group of assassins that show up in order to draw attention to herself. But even in saying "my daughter means nothing," the observation that Cassandra makes is that she is lying. And so just in the midst of all this other stuff going on, Cassandra realizes that Shiva really does see her as not worth nothing or meaning nothing. But at the same time, in other scenes, she'll say other stuff like, the equivalent of, "I brought you into this world, I will take you, or I can take you out of it," So there's so much wrong with this relationship, and so much wrong with Cassandra Cain's upbringing. She says earlier in her internal monologue in the issue that she was raised to be the ultimate assassin. And so there's some echoes of Damian Wayne, or rather the other way around, because Cassandra Cain was a character in the comics first, but maybe this part of her origin story is new. Like I said, I've not been familiar with her up to this point. But the idea of her just being like this completely deadly trained assassin, but choosing not to kill, choosing to, as she does in this issue, identify herself as the daughter of Batman, which I'm like, oh, I don't remember that kind of relationship ever being established. Is that something that she just kind of internally believes, or has there been some connection that I'm not aware of between her and Batman? It's this kind of stuff that makes me want to go back and explore Cassandra Cain's original kind of run as the Batgirl after Barbara Gordon's back was broken and she was being Oracle for a while. But I just find this so interesting and compelling. And it works for me more as Batgirl than I'll say Barbara Gordon naturally does. The reason that Barbara Gordon ultimately worked for me was because of Gail Simone's writing and how she took me into Barbara Gordon's kind of like self-deprecating attitude about herself, which I found endearing. Like she was acknowledging kind of the reservations I had about this, red gloss, flowing hair version of some kind of a Batman type of spin-off character. Well, Cassandra Cain is what I would want a quote-unquote Batgirl or Bat anything to be. Dark, shadowy, very threatening and menacing looking, and she has the background to really back it up. And so even though I do kind of miss that era of Gail Simone writing Barbara Gordon as Batgirl, I'm ready to see what Cassandra Cain is all about, both in this current presentation of the character and, as I do my homework, what came before. So I'm very intrigued and on board at this point with Batgirl, starting with issue number 1. And before I move on from Batgirl number 1, I do want to touch on something thematically interesting to me. And we see this in a number of stories. I think Damian Wayne is another example of this, where someone was raised with certain tendencies or whatever, by choices not their own. They have these certain tendencies, whether that's ingrained in them by how they were raised or something genetic or something else going on. There's this acknowledgement that like my natural tendencies that are mine, not by my own choice, lead to things that are wrong, lead to things that are destructive to myself or to others. And Batgirl is really kind of processing through that in her internal monologue. She says, "This was not my choice. My origins were not my choice. None of this was ever my choice. But I am an orphan by choice," meaning she is disassociating herself in some way from what she was naturally raised to do, or from her relationship with her mother. What exactly is meant by that isn't clear, but she is saying, I am going to choose something different than the natural tendencies that I find myself having. She says, "I am Batman's daughter by choice. I know how to kill. I hold back by choice. Because I am Batgirl, and no one, not even my mother, will ever take this from me." This has such wide-ranging application. Of course, we can think about our situations in terms of how we were raised and some of the things that might have kind of been ingrained into us by nurture, as it were, that we need to divert from. We need to choose to do different from. We need to break certain patterns that are maybe happening in our chain from our grandparents to our parents down to us. Sometimes we got to break cycles and things like that. But we can all relate to just natural tendencies, whether those are tendencies toward selfishness or anger or that are in some way sexual in nature. All of these natural feelings and tendencies we have, ultimately, we may not have the choice about whether or not we have them, but we have the choice about what we're going to do with those tendencies. Am I going to just allow my anger and my emotions to kind of get control of me? Am I going to allow my mind to wander to thoughts that I know make me anxious? Am I going to pursue sexual tendencies that I know are ultimately harmful and not part of God's design for me? All of us can relate in some way to this idea, and that is maybe one of the main reasons why I'm really interested in seeing where this story goes with Cassandra Cain and what choices she makes to divert, to fight against the natural tendencies that she finds herself experiencing. Really great thematic stuff here. Then we've got JSA number 1, again with the all-in branding. Now, we only got, 11 or 12 issues of the Jeff Johns second run, and when that started, I was like, all right, the glory days are here again. I loved Jeff Johns' original run on JSA back in the late 90s, early 2000s. But by the end of that first arc of 11, 12 issues, I was like, oh, this is kind of wrapping up feeling forced, and I'm not sure what, but I'm not liking this like I did in the old days. Maybe it's because he had too many demands on his schedule and ultimately was going to have to rush at the finish and move on to other things. Who knows? But it was a little bit of a disappointment to see us go back to 1. And I was like, who's Jeff Lemire? That's who's writing it now. That name sounds familiar, but I don't know what I know of his in the past, so I had no idea if I was going to like this. But so far, I'm really into it. And the main reason, I think, is because it's focused on legacy and character. What drives the characters and what's their connection to the legacy, the history of the DC universe. The Justice Society was publishing's first superhero team. Nothing is ever going to take that away from the Justice Society of America, with these books being published back, I think, during still World War II. These stories were being published, teaming up these Justice Society members. And over the decades of publishing, there's been the mantle's been passed down to, they evolved into the All-Star Squadron, a much bigger ensemble of superheroes. And then later, the second generation of the JSAers formed Infinity Incorporated. And in Jeff Johns' run, all these parts of DC's history are kind of considered part of JSA's history and the Justice Society's legacy. And I think that's so important to remember and to factor in when you're writing Justice Society stories, and Jeff Lemire really seems to remember that. Now, at this point, the Justice League has really taken on the unlimited mode of operation, where they just have a wide net, allowing pretty much every hero in the DC universe to kind of be a part of the Justice League. So what does that mean for the JSA? Well, some of their team members are taken off the board. Classic team members like the original, what's his name? Black Cat? I can't even remember now. Anyway, whatever the cat guy's name is. It'll come to me when I'm done recording, and I'll be really frustrated with myself. Alan Scott, original Green Lantern. Jay Garrick, the original Flash. These guys have been taken off the board by some unknown force, and the Infinity Incorporated crowd and a few others are kind of like currently the main team of JSAers and are trying to figure out, okay, what happened to the senior members and how are we going to learn to operate as a team right now? Now, thankfully, those other characters are not taken off the board completely. They are part of the story, and we get to jump to see what's happening with them once we get a little further into this issue. So I'm glad, because otherwise I would feel like, well, just call it Infinity Incorporated, But no, it looks like they're going to have multiple generations of characters side by side going forward in this book, and I am so on board for that. I'm also on board for some of the moral and relational complexity going on with, for example, Obsidian and Jade, who are both, Obsidian is the son, Jade is the daughter of Alan Scott. Obsidian has these abilities to manipulate shadows, to bring like darkness and shadows to life in a similar-ish way to Green Lantern's energy constructs, but not with near that kind of complexity. But he definitely has a dark edge to him, which has been explored in the past, and sometimes his emotions can get the better of him. And his sister Jade, who finds herself as the chairwoman of the Justice Society, is trying to kind of keep him under control because he really wants to go more hard and more extreme to figure out what happened to their missing senior members than Jade is willing for him to go on behalf of the Justice Society, whose legacy of nobility and virtue she is aiming to uphold. So the fact that they're brother and sister, it just lends itself to, I think, some conflict every now and then, in addition to love that's ultimately going to bind them together. And that's what I'm interested in. I think that it used to be much more common in comics for fights to mean, okay, now this relationship is over, whether that's a romantic relationship or some other kind of family relationship. Now we're going to be estranged from each other. It's just a device to separate characters, where I feel like I'm seeing in recent years a little bit more of these committed family relationships, sibling relationships, married relationships, or very serious dating relationships, where they are more often than they certainly used to, allowing that conflict to be the beginning point of its own thread, of its own story, rather than merely a status quo changer. And so I'm hopeful that what we'll see between Jade and Obsidian is conflict with some complexity, because they're both seeing a situation different ways, even though they ultimately kind of want roughly the same good things, to see how they resolve that kind of conflict, to see how they find common ground. I think that is so valuable right now, especially when I think about the US and how ideologically so many of us are divided on things. And, you know, even if we're just looking at the cross-section of Christians that are going to tend to be engaging with my content, there are so many different viewpoints on different things within Scripture, different doctrines and things like that. And there can be so much unnecessary divisiveness because of the kind of like the emotions and the anger that creep into how we express what we're thinking and what our differences are. There's a lot of inability to really talk about our differences without fighting about our differences, and appreciating that dialogue without allowing our different positions to actually divide us and feel like we have to be separated into our own camps. And so I'm hoping that what we'll see in this thread here will be an example of how we can see things differently and feel very strongly about our different views, but at the end of the day, try to find a way that we can compromise, work together, so that there's still at least something that we can do together and work toward together. I think that would be great to see. Okay, and I looked it up. Wildcat is the name of the Ted something or other character, I can't remember, but he is being replaced by Yolanda Montez, who I was briefly introduced to back in the day when I read Crisis on Infinite Earths. That was about when she came on the scene as Ted, oh crap, now I gotta look up his last name, that's gonna bother me. Grant, Ted Grant was the original Wildcat. So he's kind of among those who have been kidnapped, and I'm fine with that. I'm fine with Yolanda Montez coming on the scene. I never really got introduced to her very effectively back in the day. The writing wasn't very interesting, and I want them to help me invest in her now, especially because Ted Grant really, he grew on me. I generally wasn't interested in his power concept. Oh, a guy in a cat suit that's a really good boxer, whatever. But he won me over by being this older superhero, like in his 60s, but still really buff, and like the world's best boxer, at least at one time, if not still presently. And then they began to weave in this suggestion that he had acquired 9 lives at some point, supernaturally acquired 9 lives. Literally, they were keeping track, and he would kind of die in Jeff Johns' run, but survive because it was of his 9 lives. But they were keeping track, and so there was just enough mystique there, and just being a grizzled, diehard, non-quitter kind of otherwise mortal dude that I found really interesting about him. I don't know anything about Yolanda Montez, and so I hope that this isn't just kind of like a demographic box checking thing. That's not going to be enough to really pull me in. tell me who she is. What drives her? Um, yeah, I want to know something kind of unique and interesting about her. If she's more than just a really good fighter or something like that, then tell me what that little element is that's kind of like superhuman about her. So I'm hoping that I would love it if they just gave her a full issue, kind of like they did with Ted Grant early on. They gave him a solo issue where he was diehard against the entire Injustice Society. And by the end of that issue, I was like, sold! So give me an issue like that with Yolanda. Help me just totally buy in. Another striking element of this first issue of JSA is the fight going on between Rick Tyler and Jesse Quick. Rick Tyler is the Hourman, the son of the original Hourman, and Jesse Quick is the daughter of Johnny Quick and has been a speedster in the Flash mythos for decades now. And they got married at some point in publishing time 15, 20 years ago, something like that. And I thought that was really cool because suddenly there was a husband and wife on a superhero team, and they were, flirting and being affectionate, being protective of each other and stuff. And that was kind of a new, fresh, interesting dynamic for two team members to have. Well, in JSA number 1 here, they are fighting. Clearly, things are not going well in their marriage right now. He says to her, because they're on two different sides of this issue of how, like one of them is basically on Obsidian's side of how they want to handle things, really being direct and going hard. And the other is siding more with Jade and wanting to let's be conservative, let's hold to the virtues that the JSA is known for. Well, this husband and wife are on two different sides of this issue, which I think is really interesting. But at the same time, I'm like, oh, please don't have this just heading toward a divorce. That's like old school, like 90s, I feel like, comic book writing for this kind of conflict. They want to break them up so that one of them can be free to play the field, but they're in an ensemble book. I kind of don't think that would be the motivation. So anyway, he says, of Jesse, that you went on this secret mission without telling the rest of us, Jesse, without telling me. And her response is, since when are you my keeper, Rick? So interesting kind of comparison there. I mean, that phrase, my keeper, harkens back, of course, to Cain and Abel. And so this is, I'm not quite sure exactly what is meant here, but it certainly gives off kind of like a familiar feminist kind of vibe where she does not want to be seen as being dominated or subservient to her husband. Who knows what's going on behind the scenes that's making this bubble to the surface? We maybe just get a little hint a couple scenes later. Rick, for the time being, says, look, that's not this isn't the time or place for this, Jess. And she says, yeah, it never is. So clearly there's some conflict going on that she wants to bring to the surface, but from her perspective, he has not been willing to make the time for. Well, as they're kind of both storming off down a hallway later on, he says, Jesse, would you slow down for once in your life and listen to me? So he evidently feels like there's been a pattern in her not listening to him. So we see like the lines of communication are really just kind of broken down here, but they're not dealing with it in a healthy way. And she's like, what, Rick, didn't you already air enough of our dirty laundry in front of the whole team? He's like, what did you expect after what you went off and did? She says, well, what, now I have to run everything by you first? So again, this theme coming up of her feeling maybe a little bit dominated or unfairly kind of ruled over by her husband. He kind of argues for just unity right now. He says, at least we should be on the same side. And this is where she says something very interesting. And I kept looking throughout this issue. It's like, are there any boxes that are going to fill me in? They're going to tell me, go read this issue to find out how this happened. But I think a lot of what they're setting up here has not been told in another book, in another issue somewhere. It's just off-panel stuff that happened before this issue that they're going to fill us in on, I guess, over time. She says, same side. When Waller attacked and took my powers, you abandoned me. I'm like, whoa. Is there some truth to that? What did that look like? How much of that is just kind of her own description of it? How much is the truth? I don't know, but I'm really wanting to know. She says, why should I wait around for you to make up your mind? I went with Obsidian because he has conviction. She goes on, the world is on fire. The JSA needs to adapt, fight back. The man I fell in love with would have been the first one to take action. that kind of language puts their relationship in a dangerous place because she is categorizing him as a different person right now than the person that she fell in love with. It's not exactly dehumanizing him, but is certainly othering him in such a strong way that indicates how bad things are with their relationship right now. Now, again, I'm really hoping, and I think I have some reason to hope, that this is not simply going to be a thread that runs for a few issues and ends with a divorce. What I would love to see is for them to learn to communicate, and maybe over the long term have a need to continue learning to communicate, that maybe this represents them stepping out of the honeymoon period of their marriage and now really having to work through some things in life in order to be a healthy couple that can actually not just be healthy, but thrive and grow in their love for each other. And a lot of that comes from working through these kinds of communication issues, these kinds of differences in how we see things. Certainly that has been the case over the years with me and my wife. It'll be 23 years we've been married this coming January. And certainly, especially in the first 5 years, in the first 2 years is when we had our biggest, I guess what I would call fights. But over the years since then, I mean, we've learned so much about communication and how we see things differently and how to find common ground and stuff, so that there's so much more unity now, and we don't fight in the way that I think in the sense of like yelling or being angry with each other. There's some tenseness, but we've learned the tools and the things that we need to do to lovingly and self-sacrificially work through those things, so that we can have a marriage that, oh my gosh, is so much more rich and deep now because of those bumps and things that we've had to navigate over the years. And so I'm hoping that's what we'll see here, is that their love will ultimately flourish because of what they learn in the process of working through their differences and their difficulties right now. Lots of potential here. I hope that the writer, the editorial team, they see the potential and take advantage of it here. It could be some fantastic stuff. Now, one thing that both excites me and disappoints me at the end of this issue is what they do with Obsidian. I mentioned that there's a lot of interesting potential there for brother-sister conflicts, for different worldviews and reconciliation and stuff like that. I think that is still very much a possibility just because of how these characters have been portrayed in the past. They are two different characters. They do see things differently. Obsidian does have a dark side. His emotions can get the best of him. And so I think there's still all the potential there for what I mentioned earlier. However, at the end of the first issue, we see Obsidian kind of sneaking off to a corner, talking to a mysterious figure who says, "The rest of the JSA, you're sure they don't suspect you?" And then we see Obsidian transform into Johnny Sorrow, who was a villain introduced early on, if I remember correctly, in Jeff Johns', maybe still while David Goyer was also writing, but early on in that run of the JSA. And he actually, I don't think he technically originates as a Golden Age character, but they kind of retconned and said this is a forgotten Golden Age character. But basically, if you ever see his face, I think it just destroys your mind or something. There's a little tinge of Lovecraftian to his character concept, but I've always found him very interesting. I didn't know he could make himself look like other people. Anyway, so he comes into this room of mysterious figures that we were kind of hearing him have a thought conversation with or something telepathically, and we see that this room is in fact the new current iteration of the Injustice Society, with some familiar faces but also some unfamiliar ones. I am super intrigued. I just love this stuff. So yeah, they are absolutely showing that, again, this book is going to be about mining the forgotten corners of DC's publishing history, bringing those characters, villains and heroes, to the surface again and reminding us why they're cool, or giving them a fresh spin, a focus on character motivation, all those kinds of things. If they continue to go down that road, then I have no doubt that JSA will once again be one of my favorite books to read every month. So those are my thoughts about JSA #1. Really enjoying it so far. Looking now at comics released to the Ultra tier on, December 11th. and originally published on November 13th. First of those is Batman and Robin, number 15, part of the All In initiative and continuing the story arc that started last time. What I'm continuing to like about this book is the exploration of the father-son dynamic between Bruce and Damian. And I think Damian just continues to surprise me as a character that I like and care about considering that when he was first introduced, I hated his concept, I hated his personality. And now I'm just in a very different place, both because I'm a dad of boys that are closer to his age now than when he was first introduced, and I think he's in a bit of a different place as a character. He clearly respects his father. And I think even really admires his father. There's a scene in this comic where he is thinking, he's in a situation, he's like, what would father do? So he clearly admires his father, and we've seen that many times before. But it's interesting because it's juxtaposed with his ongoing conflict in some ways with Bruce, and with his very dark edge that he has to his personality, which also in another way has a surprising softening moment that I appreciate in Batman and Robin 15. Damian is so capable and so callous that it's very shocking when, as a chandelier falls and he dive tackles two people to get them out of the way in the midst of a building with the power out and that's slowly catching on fire. He saves one of them, but seemingly at first a very young girl is killed. Now we learn just a panel or two later that she is still alive, she's still holding on, but it looks for a moment like she might be dead, and Damian is yanked out of both his sense of capability and his callousness. Just last issue, he had been unkind toward this girl. He has a tendency to kind of other and dehumanize people that he is fed up with. And in this moment, he is suddenly grief-struck and comments to someone next to him that he said, I was mean to her, and then suddenly is desperate for her to be helped. And so I really appreciate this moment of softness. It's not that I want Damian to change. I think he works really well as this character, just as Batman does, as a largely dark, hard surfaced character, but that we see some of that softness come through now and then. And so this was a great moment. The father-son stuff I'm still appreciating. So yeah, very happy with what's happening right now in Batman and Robin, as exemplified in, what is this issue? Issue number 15. Green Lantern number 17. I'm still liking this book in general, although I'm ready to be done with the whole United Planets story, where the United Planets have basically found a way to become the authority over the Green Lantern Corps, which prior to them, it was always the Guardians for like millions of years or whatever. And this whole corrupt United Planets thing, it's been going on long enough. It's really a concept-driven, concept-oriented story where it's messing with status quos and stuff like that. But I really prefer character-driven stories that pull me in on the basis of how characters are feeling about their circumstances, what it means to them given the things that most drive them, that they most care about in life. And there's just a lot of status quo things happening and a large cast of characters to deal with, so that we're not really able to dive deep into individual characters near as much as I would like. But it does look like in some ways this storyline is coming to a climax, so hopefully whatever they're going to do, whatever status quo is going to change for the next season of the Green Lantern mythos, hopefully that will happen, and then we can get into stories that deal with how characters feel about their status quo, and maybe more single Green Lantern focused stories, whether that's about Hal or Kyle or John. I at the end of the day, I don't really care. I just want good character driven stories, and that's not quite where we're at right now, but I still enjoy Jeremy Adams' writing. I think he's probably just having to juggle a lot right now. So that's Green Lantern number 17. Then we've got Black Lightning number 1, also part of the All In initiative. And some interesting things going on. I've never followed this character. I've mostly seen him in team books. In fact, I don't know that he usually has had an ongoing book of his own. There's like ideas behind his concept that I find interesting. He's just, in terms of publishing history, he's an interesting character because he's one of those characters that was created in a time where they were probably trying to represent minorities more, and so in well-intentioned ways he was being created likely, but with a name like Black Lightning, it certainly speaks of a different era, where you had black superheroes or villains that have black in the title of their like their code name and stuff, and it's a little on the nose. I've always wanted them to kind of reinvent his power set a little bit so that maybe there's some kind of like a ultra power mode that he gets into every now and then where his lightning maybe changes in some way in terms of its effectiveness or what it does, but it also goes black and it becomes like a complete absence of light. I think that could be a really cool facet of his power set if they wanted to do that. I don't think they've ever done anything like that up to this point. Although in this issue, for the first time, I saw him flying, seemingly propelled by lightning, or at least not propelled, but like with a trail of lightning behind him. And I'm like, I didn't know Black Lightning could fly. When did that start happening? But anyway, he's got his two daughters with their code names Thunder and Lightning that he is trying to protect after the events of Absolute Power, where they lost their abilities and at the time were in the air, and so he was watching his daughters helplessly fall, and they did end up surviving. But in this issue, he is talking to seemingly a counselor about this situation, and he kind of has post-traumatic stress from it. I mean, he's in some ways feeling debilitated by the trauma of that experience of his daughters nearly dying, and now him feeling this really strong urge to constantly protect them that is maybe becoming a bit overbearing on his daughters. And so I like that kind of family dynamic they're setting up. Anytime we're going to, if you've been listening to me talk about DC for a little while, you know that I appreciate all these family-oriented elements, relationship-oriented elements that are being brought into comics. I feel like now, in some ways, more than ever. And so I am looking forward to seeing what they're going to do with this dynamic of a dad who wants to protect his daughters, but daughters who are, ready to kind of be on their own. They're adult women, and so understandably they would not want him to be overbearing, overprotective. At the same time, we find out that like the counselor figure that he's talking to is Dr. Lynn Stewart. I've never heard of this character before, but in the little box that introduces her as a character, it says best friend, ex-wife, mother of Thunder and Lightning. And I find this introduction very interesting, that they're best friends, even though they're divorced. That is, you do hear about that happening, that there can be a friendliness or even a friendship between couples who have divorced. That is certainly the minority, I would probably wager the strong minority of cases in divorce. What I think would be really cool here is if they started a story arc that led to reconciliation. I don't know anything about why they got divorced, anything about their history. I didn't even know Jefferson Pierce was married at one time. But the fact that they have seemingly a good relationship, she's being labeled as his best friend. I mean, your spouse really ought to be your best friend. And so the potential for them to reconcile and remarry, I mean, that's such a rare story beat to see in fiction anywhere nowadays. It would be so cool to see that play out here. But we'll see what they do with it. Finally, in Action Comics number 1075, this is a weekly book now. And they're kind of going with the multiple shorter stories in a single book each week. I don't know. I like that it comes out weekly, but I'm not really invested in several of the stories going on. I'm not invested in the Supergirl story. It's just Adventures in Space, and I'm not really into that. There's also Adventures in Space going on with Superboy and the Chinese Superman, I think it is, that I guess are kind of maybe eventually going to be related to what's happening with Superman, but it seems a little bit lighthearted and just Adventures in Spacey, and I'm just like, I'm not really into that. I would rather a single book a single story that focused on Superman and just get into his character a bit more. And with Superman's story, they are doing some of that. He, at this point, has traveled out of the Phantom Zone, but found himself traveling both through time and space, and is, of course, back on Krypton again, just like maybe days before it exploded, interacting with his mother and father, and the government agencies that were kind of up against his parents as they were trying to make the planet aware of its impending doom. Now, unfortunately, part of this storyline involves some retconning that I'm not really happy with. The kind of evil science head of the Science Council appropriates Jor-El's equipment. He's been working on the Phantom Zone projector, and so the head science guy presents this thing to the council after taking it from Jor-El and says, "I'm interested particularly in this dimensional interface Jor-El has created. Upon study, I have found that it opens an aperture to a void where living beings can exist only as helpless phantoms, unseen and unable to affect our world. Therefore, I propose we abandon the costly measures we have been using to punish the irredeemable and instead exile them with this." To which Jor-El in the background replies, "No, that's madness. To eternally confine wrongdoers to a realm without so much as tangibility, occupied only by their own thoughts, is not justice, it's borderline cruelty." And Clark, or Superman, in his mind is reacting to this, saying, "Incredible, I'd always thought that it was my father's suggestion, a rather cold one, to casually banish all criminals into the zone, an action I take purely as a last resort and never without misgivings. I like this man." So, I don't remember, I don't know what Clark is referring to in terms of thinking of his father's suggestion to use the Phantom Zone projector this way to casually banish all criminals into the zone. I'm aware that that was what Jor-El had proposed. That's part of the lore of Superman and where the Phantom Zone projector came from. But I like the complexity of this not being a perfect solution, a great solution. I think that when we are dealing with matters of justice carried out by humans, human government, there are always ways in which it is going to be unsatisfying or fall short, or not be completely just. God is the only one who is going to be able to bring about and execute on perfect judgment without any overkill and without falling short at all in what the guilty deserve. And so until that time, our efforts are always going to fall short, and there will be many times where we feel like, okay, yes, well, justice has been done, quote unquote, but it doesn't seem like it's enough, or maybe it seems like it's too much or something. And I think that is an interesting and sobering tension to live with that fiction would do well to retain instead of kind of oversimplifying things a little bit. And so I think we miss an opportunity to, yes, go back and readdress this idea that Jor-El created this Phantom Zone projector with this imperfect, maybe some would even say horrible method of carrying out justice in mind. But I would rather see Clark, I guess, wrestle with that a little bit more than for them to retcon it away and say, "Oh, no, we want readers and Clark to like Jor-El, and so we're just going to say, never mind, that wasn't actually his idea. It was all the idea of the bad man," who then says, "Your philosophies are irrelevant. My proposal stands, and it will prevail. That is all." So this authoritarian bad man is the one that gets all the credit for this, controversial decision and idea. Then Clark's, or Kal-El's mother, Laura, says, "How dare you?" And she says, "How dare you, you egotistical lackwit." So she's kind of like letting this guy have it verbally. Later on, as they manage to get out of that situation, Clark muses in his mind, "Well, turns out Jor-El's not the only one with a temper. I don't blame my mother at all for speaking truth to power, but now I'm even further away from my own time." And so he's still kind of ruminating on his difficult situation that he has to get himself out of. But that phrase, "I don't blame my mother at all for speaking truth to power," that has kind of a political ring to it. And so I'm starting to pick up on the potential for there to be kind of like a political ideology that the writing here is being motivated by. I suspect some of that ideology has something to do with, a very strong disagreement with the idea of the death penalty, which is a discussion we can have for another time. But the reason that I think that's probably an element at play is when we cut back to the Phantom Zone, we've got the evil guy there that's kind of taken over the Phantom Zone, saying to one of the criminals that had been sentenced to the zone at some point in the past, "You are a convicted criminal, are you not, with sociopathic urges that claimed the lives of innocents?" And the criminal says, "Forgive me, I repent, and then he meets his horrible fate as the big bad says, "A being who has no regard for the life of another has no claim to his own." And then there's like a splatter of blood on the big bad's face, and a sound effect indicating that he squished this guy into paste. He goes on to say, "To think I came here to offer redemption. I was sorely misguided. These rancid souls have earned only anguish. A hellscape the size of a planet, an entire world dedicated to judgment and pain from which there is no escape." So, I would love to pick the writer's brain, how much of this maybe is inspired by their musings, their thoughts, their viewpoints on the death penalty? How much of it maybe is kind of like against the idea of eternal punishment in general, the idea of hell? I mean, what he's describing here is very similar in some ways to the biblical description of those who of the lake of fire, of those who will, which is an idea we don't have reason to think that it's necessarily a literal lake of burning liquid. We don't really know. It's hard to know with the genre of the Book of Revelation, but clearly there's this idea of souls continuing to exist forever, separated from God, and in a very unhappy state. And even using the word hellscape just a little bit potentially alludes to that, an entire world dedicated to judgment and pain from which there is no escape. So, interesting stuff. But whatever the worldview that may or may not be intentionally being presented here, I do again wish that we wouldn't have kind of like whitewashed, as it were, Jor-El's past, and instead allowed that bit of moral complexity into his judgment, into his thinking, that Clark then has to wrestle with himself. Anyway, so not super excited about Action Comics these days, and those are, I guess, my thoughts for now on 1075. For my ring selection this week, I have chosen the Blue Ring for Hope because, as a whole, between the comics that released this week and the week before, I'm feeling really energized. I mean, with Batman and Robin, with Black Lightning, with several of the comics I mentioned that released last week, we're getting these great character-oriented, family, relationship-oriented threads that are a significant part of what these stories are built on. I'm totally into that. I'm very engaged at this point. Looking forward to what is going to be coming next. As I said earlier in an announcement, I'm going to be taking some time off for vacation and to crunch to get some work done before I can go on vacation. So Essential Issues Weekly will be off of its normal schedule, be missing for at least a couple of weeks. But when I get back in the first part of January, I do plan on catching up on the books that I don't talk about in the meantime. So I'm not skipping reading any books, I'm not skipping talking about any books. I'm just going to do a big catch-up, one or two extra size installments of Essential Issues Weekly. So thank you for your patience as I take some time off. In the meantime, I hope you will check out christiangeekcentral.com. There's tons of stuff there for you as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.